Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The silence in the Arctic Research Station was absolute, broken only by the distant howl of wind across the tundra and the soft hum of machinery keeping Dr. Thaddeus Grimm alive in this frozen wasteland. At 29, he had already earned a reputation as one of the most brilliant minds in primordial cosmology, but tonight, surrounded by banks of computers and radio telescopes pointing toward the edge of the observable universe, he felt smaller than the atoms he studied. The observation dome stretched above him like a cathedral of science, its transparent aluminum panels offering an unobstructed view of the star-filled sky. Here, 300 miles north of Fairbanks, light pollution was non-existent, and the cosmos revealed itself in all its terrible majesty. The aurora borealis painted green curtains across the darkness, dancing to rhythms older than human civilization, but Thaddeus barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the screens before him, displaying data that should not exist. The Arctic Station. Omega 7 had been his home for 8 months now, ever since the university had approved his request for extended deep space observation time. The isolation didn't bother him. In fact, he preferred it. Here, surrounded by nothing but ice and stars, he could focus on the questions that had consumed him since his sister's death 3 years ago. For 6 weeks he had been tracking anomalies in the cosmic microwave background radiation, the faint echo of the Big Bang that permeated all of space. These weren't the usual fluctuations that cosmologists expected to find. These were voids, regions where the fundamental forces of nature appeared to be absent entirely. Not weakened or distorted, but completely missing, as if the universe had simply forgotten how to hold itself together in those specific locations. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, but Thaddeus barely registered the bitter taste when he took an absent-minded sip. His eyes were bloodshot from staring at screens for 16 hours straight. His back ached from hunching over keyboards, and his mind raced with implications that threatened to shatter everything he thought he knew about reality. The data streams flowing across his monitors showed a pattern that defied explanation. The void regions weren't random cosmic accidents. They appeared to be expanding in a coordinated fashion, growing larger and more numerous with each passing day. More disturbing still, they seemed to be moving through space with what could only be described as intention, drifting toward areas of higher matter density, like predators stalking prey. Thaddeus had first noticed the anomalies 3 weeks after returning from his sister's funeral. Ophelia had died in a house fire while he was presenting a paper on nuclear synthesis at a conference in Geneva. The irony wasn't lost on him. While he was explaining to a room full of academics how the first atoms had formed in the cooling universe, his twin sister was being reduced to ash and memories. By the time he received the call and flew home, there was nothing left but a blackened shell of what had once been her apartment. The fire investigators said it had started with a faulty space heater, spreading too quickly for her to escape. But those clinical details couldn't answer the question that would consume the next 3 years of his life. How could someone so vibrantly alive simply cease to exist? The funeral had been a blur of condolences and bureaucratic details, but one moment remained crystal clear. Standing beside her grave, watching the casket disappear into the earth, he had asked the minister where she had gone. The man had offered platitudes about heaven and eternal rest, but Thaddeus needed something more concrete, more scientific. He needed to understand the fundamental nature of existence and non-existence. That obsession had driven him to study the earliest moments of the universe, the period when the first atoms formed from the primordial soup of energy that followed the Big Bang. If he could understand how something came from nothing, perhaps he could understand how something could return to nothing. It was a morbid fascination, but it gave him purpose during the long months of grief. His colleagues at the university had been supportive but concerned. Dr. Harrison Wells, the department head, had gently suggested that perhaps Thaddeus was projecting his personal loss onto his research. But Thaddeus knew better. The void regions he was discovering were real, measurable, and growing. They represented something far more significant than one man's grief. Now, staring at evidence that the universe was somehow being selectively edited, he wondered if his questions had been answered in the worst possible way. The radio telescope array hummed softly beneath the dome, its massive dishes tracking signals from billions of light years away. The equipment was state-of-the-art, capable of detecting the faintest whispers from the cosmic dark. The primary dish was 12 meters across, supplemented by 8 smaller arrays that could be synchronized to create a virtual telescope with incredible resolution. The whole system had cost the university $40 million and represented the pinnacle of astronomical technology. But tonight, those whispers seemed to be saying something that made his blood run cold. The central computer processed terabytes of data every hour, filtering out terrestrial interference and amplifying the ancient signals from the edge of space. Thaddeus had spent months calibrating the system, learning its quirks and capabilities. He knew every circuit, every connection, every line of code that translated cosmic radiation into meaningful information, which made what he was seeing even more impossible to explain. The void regions showed up as areas of perfect silence in the cosmic background radiation. Not the normal variations caused by matter clumping together in the early universe, but complete absence. It was as if someone had taken an eraser to reality, removing not just matter and energy, but the very possibility of their existence. Thaddeus reached for his coffee mug, needing the caffeine to stay alert for what promised to be another sleepless night. But as his fingers closed around the ceramic, he paused. The mug felt different, lighter somehow. Looking down, he saw that the surface was changing, the smooth glaze developing a rough, granular texture, as if the clay beneath was returning to its component particles. The transformation was subtle at first, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The ceramic seemed to be losing its density, becoming more porous. The molecular bonds that held the fired clay together were weakening, allowing the material to revert to something closer to its original state before the intense heat of the kiln had fused it into a solid form. He set the mug down carefully and watched in fascination and growing horror as it continued to deteriorate. The handle began to sag, its structural integrity failing as the ceramic became increasingly soft and malleable. The surface developed a chalky appearance, as if the glaze was being absorbed back into the clay beneath. Steam rose from the liquid inside, but it wasn't the normal vapor of evaporation. The coffee itself was coming apart, its complex molecules unraveling into their constituent atoms. The aromatic compounds that gave it flavor and smell were dissipating, leaving behind a colorless, odorless liquid that bore no resemblance to the dark brew he had poured hours earlier. Within minutes, the mug had crumbled into a pile of fine dust that scattered across his desk with the slightest air current. The liquid had evaporated completely, leaving only a faint stain that faded even as he watched. It was as if the very memory of the object was being erased along with its physical form. Thaddeus's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. The implications of what he had just witnessed were staggering. The void regions he had been studying weren't just distant astronomical phenomena. They were somehow manifesting here, in his laboratory, affecting the matter around him in real time. The boundary between observation and reality was breaking down in ways that violated everything he understood about physics. He dialed Minerva Blackthorn's number with shaking fingers, trying to keep his voice steady as he waited for her to answer. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up, her voice thick with sleep and irritation. "Thaddeus, do you have any idea what time it is?" "Minerva, I need you to come to the station right now." "It's 2 in the morning. Whatever breakthrough you think you've had can wait until sunrise." "No, it can't." He looked around the dome, noting how his research notebooks were beginning to yellow at the edges, their pages curling as if exposed to intense heat. The metal desk lamp beside his computer was developing a dull, oxidized appearance, its chrome finish losing its luster. Something is happening here, something that shouldn't be possible. There was a pause, and when Minerva spoke again, her voice carried a note of genuine concern. She had known him long enough to recognize when his excitement had crossed the line into genuine fear. "You sound terrified. What's going on up there?" "The void regions I've been tracking in deep space. They're not just empty areas where matter happens to be absent. They're actively preventing the formation of atomic structures, and somehow they're manifesting here in the station. My equipment is dissolving, Minerva. The building itself is losing structural integrity." "That's impossible. You know that's impossible." "I know what I'm seeing. Matter is reverting to its pre-atomic state right in front of me. The molecular bonds that hold everything together are simply ceasing to function." Another pause, longer this time. Minerva Blackthorn had been his closest colleague for 5 years, ever since they had met at a conference on early universe cosmology in Stockholm. She was brilliant, methodical, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to cut through complex problems to their essential nature. More importantly, she knew him well enough to distinguish between his occasional flights of theoretical fancy and genuine scientific observations. "All right," she said finally. "I'll fire up the snowmobile and head over. But Thaddeus, if this turns out to be another one of your late-night theoretical breakthroughs that could have waited until morning, I'm going to throw you out into a snowbank." The line went dead. Thaddeus looked at his phone and watched in horror as the plastic case began to soften and deform in his grip. The rigid polymer was becoming flexible, then pliable, then almost liquid. He set it down quickly, afraid it would melt completely in his hands. While waiting for Minerva, he tried to document what he was seeing. His pen felt wrong in his hand, the plastic barrel becoming soft and the ink flowing strangely across the paper, as if the chemical bonds that gave it consistency were breaking down. The words he wrote began to fade almost immediately, disappearing like messages written in steam on a mirror. The phenomenon was affecting everything in a specific order. First, complex organic compounds broke down into simpler molecules. Then, inorganic materials began to lose their crystalline structure. Finally, even the most basic atomic bonds started to weaken, causing matter to revert to something approaching its pre-atomic state. He switched to his laptop, hoping to create a digital record of the events. But the keys felt spongy beneath his fingers, and the screen flickered with increasing frequency. Error messages began appearing in his files, not software glitches, but actual gaps in the data where information simply ceased to exist. The computer's memory was being affected at the most fundamental level, as if the electrons that stored the information were losing their ability to maintain stable orbits around atomic nuclei. The phenomenon was spreading in a pattern he recognized from his astronomical observations. It moved in concentric circles, radiating outward from the main telescope array at the center of the dome. First his immediate workspace, then the equipment racks, then the structural elements of the building itself. The effect was slow but relentless, like a tide of nothingness washing over everything in its path. Thaddeus tried to remain calm, to approach this as a scientist rather than a terrified observer. He grabbed a digital camera and began taking photographs. but the images came out distorted, showing strange artifacts that seemed to exist in a state between presence and absence. The camera's CCD sensor was having difficulty processing light from objects that were losing their atomic cohesion. The resulting pictures showed ghostly outlines where solid matter should have been. He walked to the main telescope control panel and began shutting down the array, hoping to sever whatever connection had been established between his equipment and the void regions. But as his hands moved across the controls, he realized the buttons were becoming less responsive, the plastic softening under his touch like warm wax. The metal housing of the control panel was developing a rough, corroded appearance, as if years of oxidation were occurring in minutes. The electromagnetic spectrum analyzer showed readings that made no sense. The void regions were emitting energy, but not in any form that conventional physics could explain. It was as if they were broadcasting a signal that caused matter to forget how to maintain its structural integrity. Through the dome's transparent panels, he could see the aurora borealis dancing overhead, but even those ethereal lights seemed dimmer than usual, as if the atmospheric particles that created them were being affected by whatever was happening in the station. The sound of a snowmobile engine cut through the Arctic wind. Thaddeus watched through the dome's increasingly hazy panels as Minerva's headlight cut through the darkness, bouncing and weaving as she navigated the rough terrain between the base camp and the observation station. She parked outside the airlock and hurried inside, her heavy winter gear making her look like an astronaut returning from an alien world. "Thaddeus, what in God's name is—" She stopped mid-sentence as she stepped into the dome and took in the state of the equipment. Her usually skeptical expression shifted to one of genuine alarm as she saw the deteriorating instruments and the unnatural shimmer in the air around the telescope array. Minerva Blackthorne was not easily impressed or frightened. At 32, she had seen enough strange phenomena in her career to maintain a healthy skepticism about most extraordinary claims. She had investigated gamma-ray bursts that could sterilize entire star systems, studied black holes that could warp space-time itself, and observed stellar collisions that released more energy in seconds than the sun would produce in its entire lifetime. But what she was witnessing now defied every rational explanation she could think of. The air inside the dome felt different, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. There was a pressure change that her ears detected, as if the atmosphere itself was becoming less substantial. The familiar hum of electronic equipment was punctuated by strange harmonics, frequencies that seemed to resonate with something beyond normal sound. "Show me what happened," she said, pulling off her helmet and approaching the workstation where Thaddeus's coffee mug had disintegrated. "It started about 2 hours ago," he explained, pointing to the faint outline that was all that remained of the ceramic. The mug was sitting right there, completely normal. Then it began to lose cohesion, as if the atoms themselves were forgetting how to bind together. Minerva reached out to touch the desk surface and pulled her hand back quickly. The metal was warm, but not from any external heat source. It felt almost alive, vibrating with a subtle energy that made her fingertips tingle. The surface was becoming soft and malleable, like metal that had been heated to its melting point but without any increase in temperature. "It's spreading outward from the telescope array," Thaddeus continued. "Whatever I've been observing in deep space, I think I've created some kind of entanglement that's allowing it to manifest here." "That's impossible, Thaddeus. Observation doesn't change the fundamental nature of matter. The whole point of scientific objectivity is that reality exists independently of our perception of it." "Does it?" He led her to the main console, where the data streams continued to flow across screens that were becoming increasingly unstable. "Look at these readings. The void regions show complete absence of the strong nuclear force. No atomic binding, no molecular structure. It's like the universe is reverting to its pre-atomic state." The monitor displayed a three-dimensional map of the cosmic background radiation. with the void regions appearing as dark spheres scattered throughout space. But as they watched, the spheres were growing, expanding slowly but measurably. More disturbing still, new voids were appearing, as if the phenomenon was spreading from the original sources like some kind of cosmic infection. "Look at the timestamps," Thaddeus said, pointing to the data logs. "Each new void appears exactly 23 minutes and 14 seconds after I begin observing a specific region of space. The correlation is perfect." Minerva studied the data, her scientific training warring with the evidence before her eyes. That would suggest some kind of instantaneous effect across billions of light years. It violates causality, relativity, everything we know about the speed of information transfer. "Unless," Thaddeus said quietly, "consciousness operates outside the normal constraints of space-time." As they watched, one of the monitors began to warp visibly, its edges becoming less defined as if the screen were melting. The keyboard beneath Thaddeus's hands felt increasingly unreliable, the plastic keys losing their shape and becoming difficult to press. The computer's processing power was declining as the circuits that carried electrical impulses began to lose their atomic cohesion. "We need to call for help," Minerva said, reaching for her radio. But as she activated the device, it crumbled in her hands like a stale cookie, the metal components becoming soft and pliable as modeling clay. The battery leaked its chemical contents onto her gloves, but even that corrosive liquid seemed to evaporate within seconds. "My snowmobile," she said, rushing to the airlock. Through the transparent panels, they could see her vehicle outside, but it was changing in real time. The engine block was sagging like melting ice cream. The fuel lines were dissolving into wisps of vapor, and the metal frame was becoming increasingly abstract, as if it were transitioning from three-dimensional reality into a two-dimensional sketch. "We're trapped," Thaddeus said quietly. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. Whatever was happening here, it was beyond their ability to control or escape. The phenomenon was accelerating. What had taken hours to affect small objects was now happening in minutes. The dome support structure was losing its integrity, the aluminum beams becoming soft and pliable. The transparent panels were developing a frosted appearance, as if the molecular structure of the aluminum oxide was becoming randomized. Thaddeus reached up unconsciously to touch the silver locket he wore beneath his shirt, the one that contained the last photograph of his twin sister, Ophelia. It had been taken just weeks before her death, at a family gathering where she had been laughing at something their father had said. Her smile was radiant, full of life and promise, captured in a moment of pure joy that he had treasured for 3 years. The locket had been their grandmother's, passed down through generations of women in their family. Ophelia had inherited it when she turned 18, but she had given it to Thaddeus the day before he left for graduate school, saying that he needed something to remind him that he wasn't alone in the world. But now the locket felt different. Lighter. He pulled it out with trembling hands and watched in horror as the silver chain began to flow like liquid mercury. The metal was losing its crystalline structure. The atoms that had been locked in place for decades suddenly free to move and reorganize themselves. The locket itself was becoming translucent, and the photograph inside was fading as the silver halides in the film lost their ability to hold the image. "No," he whispered, watching this last physical connection to his sister disappear. "Not this. Please, not this." The photograph had been his anchor to reality after her death. Without it, he feared she would fade from his memory entirely, becoming just another void in his life that nothing could fill. He had looked at it every morning for 3 years, remembering her laugh, her voice, the way she could make him smile even during his darkest moments. As the image dissolved, he could feel pieces of his memory going with it. The sound of her laugh became fainter, harder to recall. The exact shade of her eyes grew uncertain. Even the words she had spoken at their last conversation began to blur together, losing their specificity and meaning. Minerva placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, but he could feel that her touch was different too. Her gloves were becoming less substantial, the synthetic materials that protected her from the Arctic cold losing their ability to maintain their molecular structure. "Thaddeus, we need to focus on the immediate problem," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear you could see in her eyes. "There has to be a way to stop this before it spreads beyond the station." He nodded, forcing himself to think clearly despite the grief and terror threatening to overwhelm him. The previous research team, Dr. Cornelius Ashworth and his group, were stationed here before us. There might be records, backup files that could tell us what happened to them. They began searching the station's computer systems, racing against time as the equipment continued to deteriorate around them. The main server was housed in a shielded compartment designed to protect the data from electromagnetic interference, but even that protection was failing as the atomic bonds holding the shielding together began to weaken. Finally, buried in encrypted backup drives that had somehow survived the general deterioration, they found Ashworth's research logs. The files painted a picture of scientists who had stumbled onto something far beyond their understanding, documenting their growing horror as they realized what they had unleashed. "Listen to this," Minerva said, reading from one of the files. "Day 47 of the anomaly. The void regions are not passive phenomena. They exhibit what can only be described as intention. They seek out concentrations of matter and systematically dissolve them, returning complex structures to the pre-atomic state that existed before the first nuclei formed in the cooling universe." "Keep reading," Thaddeus urged, watching as more of the dome's support structure began to lose its integrity. The stars were becoming visible through gaps in the ceiling, where the aluminum panels had become too insubstantial to block the light. Day 53. "I understand now what we're dealing with. The void is not empty space. It is full of potential, of all the things that could have been but never were. It represents the state of infinite possibility that existed before the universe chose to manifest in this particular configuration, and it wants to return everything to that state." The implications were staggering. They weren't dealing with a simple absence of matter, but with an active force that sought to undo creation itself. The void regions represented a kind of cosmic nostalgia, a yearning for the simplicity that had existed before the complexity of atoms, molecules, and life had cluttered the perfect emptiness of space. "What happened to Ashworth and his team?" Thaddeus asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. Minerva continued scrolling through the files, her expression growing more grim with each entry. The logs become increasingly fragmented after day 55. Ashworth mentions that the phenomenon is affecting their ability to maintain coherent thoughts, as if consciousness itself is being dissolved along with matter. "But there's something else," she continued. On day 57, his final entry, he mentions an emergency protocol. If they could overload the station's power core and create a localized electromagnetic pulse, they might be able to sever the connection between their observation equipment and the void regions. Did it work? The entries stop there, but the protocol is detailed, including schematics and procedures. According to his calculations, the electromagnetic pulse would need to be sustained for at least 7 minutes to completely disrupt the entanglement. "Where's the power core located?" "According to these schematics, it's in the basement generator room." They looked at each other, both understanding the terrible implication. The basement was 3 levels below the dome, and if the dissolution effect was spreading downward at the same rate it was spreading outward, the lower levels of the station would be in an even more advanced state of decay. The dome around them continued its slow dissolution. The aluminum framework was losing its structural integrity, becoming more like a suggestion of architecture than actual building material. Through the dissolving walls, they could see the aurora borealis overhead, but even those ethereal lights were beginning to flicker and fade, as the atmospheric particles that created them were consumed by the expanding void. The temperature inside the dome was dropping rapidly, as the heating system failed. Without the protection of solid walls, the Arctic cold was beginning to seep in, but Thaddeus realized that conventional hypothermia might be the least of their concerns. As their bodies lost atomic cohesion, the very concept of temperature might become meaningless. "There's something else in Ashworth's notes," Minerva said, her voice growing quiet as she continued reading. "He mentions that the void requires a conscious observer to maintain its connection to our reality. Without someone to perceive it, to acknowledge its existence, it cannot fully manifest in our dimension. So by studying it, by focusing my attention on it night after night, I've been feeding it. More than that, you've been inviting it in." The revelation hit Thaddeus like a physical blow. His obsession with understanding the nature of existence and non-existence, driven by grief over his sister's death, had made him the perfect conduit for the void's influence. His desperate need to comprehend how something could become nothing had created a resonance that allowed nothingness to seep into the world of something. He thought about all those nights spent staring at the data, analysing the void regions with single-minded intensity. Each observation had strengthened the connection. Each measurement had made the boundary between observation and reality more permeable. His grief had become a beacon that attracted the very force he was trying to understand. "There's one more thing," Minerva said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ashworth's final calculations suggest that the electromagnetic pulse won't just sever the connection. It will require someone to manually maintain the power core stability throughout the process, and that person would have to remain in the containment chamber," Thaddeus finished, "right next to the void." The basement of the research station was a labyrinth of corridors and equipment rooms carved into the permafrost. Under normal circumstances, it was kept warm and well lit, filled with the hum of generators and climate control systems. But as Thaddeus and Minerva made their way down the increasingly unstable stairwell, they found a very different environment. The walls were becoming translucent, allowing them to see through solid concrete into spaces that shouldn't exist. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, their glass tubes becoming soft and pliable. The air itself felt thinner, as if the atmosphere was being consumed along with everything else. The journey down 3 levels was treacherous. The stairs had become unreliable, the concrete losing cohesion with each step they took. Thaddeus found himself gripping the handrail, only to have it crumble in his grasp. The metal was warm to the touch, vibrating with the same strange energy that was affecting everything else in the station. Their voices echoed strangely in the dissolving corridors, sometimes loud and clear, sometimes muffled, as if they were speaking underwater. Reality was becoming negotiable, subject to forces that operated by rules no human mind could comprehend. On the second basement level, they encountered something that stopped them both in their tracks. A section of the corridor wall had become completely transparent, revealing a space that definitely hadn't been there when the station was built. It was a room filled with swirling patterns of darkness and light, where geometric forms that hurt to look at directly moved through dimensions that seemed to fold in on themselves. "Don't look directly at it," Minerva warned, but Thaddeus was already mesmerized by the impossible geometry. The space seemed to extend infinitely in all directions while simultaneously being no bigger than a closet. Objects within it appeared to exist in multiple states simultaneously, solid and gaseous, present and absent, real and imaginary. They hurried past the anomalous space, but Thaddeus could feel it watching them, evaluating them with an intelligence that predated human consciousness by billions of years. The third basement level was worse. Here, the dissolution effect was so advanced that they could barely distinguish between floor, walls, and ceiling. The boundaries between different materials had become fluid, creating a dreamlike environment where concrete flowed like water and metal bent like rubber. They reached the generator room just as the ceiling above them began to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by an unseen hand. The space was filled with the low, thrumming hum of the power core, but surrounding it was something that defied description. It wasn't darkness because darkness was simply the absence of light. This was the absence of everything. A negation so complete that it seemed to pull at the edges of their vision. It wasn't cold because cold was still a measurable quantity. This was the absence of temperature, the negation of the very concept of thermal energy. The power core sat in the center of the room like a technological heart, its surface covered with control panels and monitoring equipment that was slowly succumbing to the same dissolution, affecting everything else. But beyond it, in the space that should have been filled with backup generators and electrical equipment, there was only void. And the void was alive. It pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to match their heartbeats, expanding and contracting like some vast cosmic lung. Within its depths, they could see flashes of impossible colors, hues that had no names because they existed outside the normal spectrum of electromagnetic radiation. Shapes moved through the darkness, geometric forms that seemed to follow mathematical principles that hadn't been discovered yet. According to Ashworth's notes, someone needs to manually maintain the power core's stability while it overloads, Minerva read from the tablet computer she had brought with them, her voice shaking as she tried to concentrate on the technical details while the universe came apart around them. The electromagnetic pulse has to be precisely calibrated to disrupt the entanglement without destroying the local space-time entirely. And that someone has to remain in the containment chamber, Thaddeus said, studying the setup, right next to the void. The containment chamber was a transparent aluminum box designed to protect technicians from radiation while they worked on the power core, but now it served a different purpose entirely. It was the only space in the room where the dissolution effect seemed to be held in check, creating a small bubble of stability in an increasingly unstable reality. He looked at the control panels, trying to understand the process Ashworth had outlined. The electromagnetic pulse would need to be sustained for exactly 7 minutes and 34 seconds, long enough to completely sever the entanglement between their observation equipment and the distant void regions. But maintaining the power core's stability during such an overload would require constant manual adjustment, compensating for fluctuations that no automated system could anticipate. More critically, the radiation levels in the containment chamber during the pulse would be lethal. Not immediately, but the exposure would cause irreversible cellular damage that would prove fatal within hours. The person who operated the controls would be committing suicide to save reality itself. There has to be another way, Minerva insisted, her scientific training rebelling against the idea of human sacrifice. Some kind of automated system, a way to program the controls and get clear before the pulse begins. Ashworth tried that approach, Thaddeus said, reading through the dead scientist's notes. Look at his calculations from day 56. The void interferes with any electronic systems that try to control the process. It's as if it can sense when humans are trying to distance themselves from the decision, and it adapts accordingly. What do you mean? The void doesn't just consume matter, it consumes the concept of automation, the idea that complex processes can occur without conscious oversight. It forces conscious beings to take direct responsibility for their choices, even when those choices are terrible. Thaddeus thought about his sister, about the questions that had driven him to this moment. He had wanted to understand how something could come from nothing, but now he realized he had been asking the wrong question all along. The real question was how something could choose to remain something in the face of infinite nothing. Consciousness, he now understood, wasn't just along for the ride in a universe governed by impersonal physical laws. It was the force that kept those laws functioning, the will that maintained the boundary between existence and non-existence. Every conscious being in the universe was, in some small way, voting for reality to continue existing with every moment of awareness. And when that voting process broke down, when consciousness became too focused on the possibility of non-existence, the void could seep through the cracks. "I have to be the one," he said quietly. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way, you know that. You've read Ashworth's notes. The pulse has to be maintained manually, and the person who does it won't survive the radiation exposure." Minerva was quiet for a long moment, studying the control panels and trying to find some flaw in Ashworth's reasoning. But the mathematics were sound, the physics inescapable. Someone would have to sacrifice themselves to contain the void, and they both knew it had to be Thaddeus. "You could come with me," he said, "into the chamber. We could operate the controls together." "No, someone needs to survive this. Someone needs to document what happened here and make sure it doesn't happen again. Someone needs to warn the world that consciousness and reality are connected in ways we never imagined." The void pulsed around them, growing larger with each cycle. Through its depths, Thaddeus could see flashes of other places, other times. Laboratories where other scientists had asked the same questions he had asked. Observatories, where the boundary between something and nothing had grown thin. Each location was a node in a vast network that spanned the globe, connected by the terrible knowledge that reality was far more fragile than anyone had ever imagined. "Tell them what happened here," he said to Minerva, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Tell them that the universe is more fragile than we ever imagined. Tell them that consciousness isn't just a byproduct of complex matter, but the force that allows matter to exist in the first place." Before she could protest further, he stepped into the containment chamber. The space around him immediately felt different, more stable, as if his presence was somehow anchoring reality in place. The control panels responded to his touch, their displays becoming clearer and more coherent. But beyond the transparent walls, the void was waiting for him. As he began the startup sequence for the electromagnetic pulse, images flooded his mind. Visions of the universe before the Big Bang, when nothing existed, and everything was potential. He saw the moment when energy first condensed into matter, when the fundamental forces chose to manifest rather than remaining in perfect, sterile equilibrium. And in that primordial darkness, he saw Ophelia. She was there in the void, not as she had been in life, but as pure possibility. All the things she might have become, all the experiences she might have had, all the love she might have shared. It was all there in the infinite potential of the pre-atomic state. She smiled at him with a radiance that transcended physical form, and he understood that this was not death, but transformation. The void spoke to him without words, its communication bypassing language entirely and speaking directly to his consciousness. It showed him the peace of non-existence, the freedom from pain and loss that came with returning to the state of infinite possibility. All he had to do was let go, allow himself to be dissolved, back into the potential from which all things emerged. The temptation was overwhelming. For 3 years, he had carried the weight of grief, the constant ache of Ophelia's absence. The void offered him release from that burden, reunion with his sister in a state where loss was impossible, because nothing could be lost. But as he reached toward her image, he realized the truth that had eluded him for 3 years. The void could not be destroyed, only contained. And someone had to remain at the boundary, holding the line between existence and nothingness. Someone had to choose, again and again, that something was better than nothing. He placed his hands on the power core controls and felt his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his physical form. His awareness stretched across dimensions, touching the fundamental forces that held matter together throughout the observable universe. He could feel the void pressing against reality like a tide of unbeing, seeking to return everything to its original state of infinite potential. But he could also feel something else, something that filled him with wonder despite his terror. The will of every conscious being that had ever existed. The collective choice of the universe to remain manifest rather than returning to the void. Stars chose to burn rather than collapse into nothingness. Planets chose to maintain their orbits rather than drifting into the dark. Life chose to persist rather than surrendering to entropy. And now he chose to hold the line. The electromagnetic pulse began as a low hum that he felt in his bones rather than heard with his ears. The power core's output spiked to dangerous levels, channeling more energy than it was designed to handle. Warning lights flashed red around the containment chamber, but Thaddeus ignored them, his attention focused entirely on maintaining the delicate balance that would sustain the pulse for the required duration. The radiation was immediate and intense. He could feel it penetrating his body, disrupting the cellular machinery that kept him alive. His DNA was being systematically shredded by high-energy particles, but somehow his consciousness remained intact, expanded and enhanced by proximity to the void. Through his heightened awareness, he could perceive the connection between the observation equipment and the distant void regions. It appeared as a shimmering thread of possibility that stretched across billions of light years, a quantum entanglement that existed outside the normal constraints of space and time. The electromagnetic pulse was working, weakening the thread with each passing second. But the void was fighting back. It reached out to him through the connection, offering visions of peace and reunification. He saw Ophelia again, more clearly this time, extending her hand toward him with an expression of infinite love and understanding. The pain of her loss, which had defined his existence for 3 years, could end here. All he had to do was let go of his hold on the controls and allow himself to be drawn into the infinite potential of nothingness. "Don't listen to it," Minerva's voice reached him through the containment chamber's communication system. She was monitoring his vital signs, watching as the radiation slowly destroyed his body. "Remember why you're doing this. Remember what you're protecting." But the void's whispers were becoming louder, more insistent. It showed him images of the universe's future. Billions of years of heat, death, and entropy, ending in a cold, empty cosmos where nothing existed and nothing ever would again. Wouldn't it be kinder to end the struggle now, to return everything to the peaceful simplicity of non-existence? Thaddeus gritted his teeth and forced himself to concentrate on the controls. The electromagnetic pulse needed to be sustained for 3 more minutes to completely sever the connection. His hands were shaking now, both from radiation sickness and from the immense effort required to resist the void's influence. Through his expanded consciousness, he could see other nodes of the network, other places where scientists had encountered the void and been forced to make similar choices. Some had succeeded in containing it, becoming eternal guardians of the boundary between existence and nothingness. Others had failed, allowing entire research facilities to be consumed before emergency protocols could be activated. He was part of something larger now, a cosmic immune system that protected reality from its own fundamental instability. The universe was not the stable, eternal structure that most people imagined. It was a temporary aberration, a brief moment of complexity in an infinite sea of possibility, maintained only by the will of conscious beings who chose existence over oblivion. 2 minutes remaining. The void intensified its assault on his mind, flooding him with memories of every loss he had ever experienced. His parents' death in a car accident when he was 17. The end of his relationship with Sarah, the woman he had thought he would marry. The failure of his first major research project, which had nearly ended his academic career. Each painful memory was amplified and distorted, designed to convince him that existence was nothing but suffering and disappointment. But alongside those memories came others. The joy on Ophelia's face when she had graduated from medical school. The satisfaction of solving a particularly difficult theoretical problem. The wonder he had felt as a child, looking up at the stars and realizing that he was made of the same atoms that had been forged in their hearts. Existence was not just suffering. It was also beauty, discovery, love, and the infinite possibility of growth and change. Yes, conscious beings experience pain, but they also experience joy. Yes, they faced loss, but they also found connection. The void offered escape from suffering, but it also meant the end of everything beautiful and meaningful that consciousness had ever created. 1 minute remaining, Thaddeus could feel his body failing. The radiation had damaged too many vital systems for him to survive much longer. His vision was blurring, his muscles were weak, and he could taste blood in his mouth. But his consciousness remained sharp, focused entirely on maintaining the pulse that would save reality itself. The thread connecting their reality to the void regions was almost severed now, frayed to the point where only the thinnest strand remained. But that final connection was the strongest, reinforced by the void's desperate attempt to maintain its foothold in the physical universe. 30 seconds, Minerva's voice was tight with emotion. She knew what was happening to him, knew that he was dying to save not just their station, but potentially the entire universe. The void made one final attempt to claim him, showing him Ophelia's death in excruciating detail. He saw her trapped in the burning apartment, calling his name as the smoke filled her lungs. He felt her terror, her pain, her desperate hope that somehow he would arrive in time to save her. But then he saw something else, something the void hadn't intended to show him. He saw Ophelia making a choice in those final moments, not to give in to despair, but to hold on to love. She had spent her last conscious thoughts not on her own suffering, but on her hope that he would be safe, that he would continue to find meaning and purpose in life even after she was gone. She had chosen something over nothing, even in the face of death. 10 seconds, Minerva announced. Thaddeus felt the final strand of connection between their reality and the void region snap like an overstressed cable. The electromagnetic pulse completed its work, severing the entanglement that had allowed nothingness to bleed into their world. But the effort of maintaining the pulse for the full duration had cost him everything. He collapsed against the control panel, his body finally succumbing to the massive radiation exposure. But his consciousness didn't fade. Instead, it expanded further, encompassing not just the station but the entire local region of space-time. He could feel the boundary between existence and void stabilizing, held in place by his will alone. He had become something new, something between human and cosmic force. Part of his awareness remained anchored to his failing body, but most of it now existed in a state that transcended physical form. He was the guardian of this particular weak point in reality, ensuring that the void could never again use it as an entry point into the physical universe. Minerva felt the station stabilize around her. The dissolving walls reformed, their atomic structure restored to normal. The melting equipment regained its shape and function, and the oppressive weight of approaching nothingness lifted like a fever breaking. But she knew that Thaddeus was still there, existing in a state between matter and void, forever holding the boundary that kept the universe intact. She made her way back to the surface, documenting everything she had witnessed. The dome was intact again, its equipment showing normal readings, but fundamentally changed. The telescope array no longer detected void regions in the cosmic background radiation. The connection had been severed, but at a price that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the months that followed, Minerva established a new research protocol, one that approached the study of fundamental cosmology with the reverence it deserved. She reached out to colleagues around the world, sharing her findings with those she trusted to handle such dangerous knowledge responsibly. What she discovered changed everything she thought she knew about the universe. Similar incidents had occurred throughout history, she learned. The great library of Alexandria hadn't been destroyed by fire and neglect, but by scholars who had delved too deeply into certain forbidden texts and accidentally opened a gateway to nothingness. The Tunguska event in 1908 hadn't been caused by a meteor or comet, but by a Russian scientist whose experiments with consciousness and reality had gone catastrophically wrong. Each incident had been contained by individuals who had sacrificed themselves to maintain the boundary between existence and void. They formed a secret network of guardians. Consciousness spread across multiple dimensions, holding reality together through sheer force of will. Minerva began training a new generation of scientists, carefully selecting individuals who possessed both the intellectual capacity to understand the true nature of reality and the emotional stability to handle such knowledge without being corrupted by it. They called themselves the Observers, and their mission was simple: to monitor the weak points in space-time and ensure that the void could never again gain a foothold in the physical universe. The training was intensive and dangerous. Candidates had to learn to expand their consciousness without losing their connection to physical reality. They studied meditation techniques developed by ancient mystics alongside cutting-edge theories of consciousness and cosmology. Most importantly, they learned to recognize the signs of void intrusion and the protocols for containing it. Some candidates didn't survive the training. The human mind wasn't designed to perceive reality at such a fundamental level, and the strain could cause permanent psychological damage or even death. But those who succeeded became part of something larger than themselves, guardians of the miracle of existence. The Observers established monitoring stations at key points around the globe, places where the boundary between existence and void was naturally thin. The Arctic station where Thaddeus had made his sacrifice became their primary headquarters, its instruments constantly scanning for signs of new void incursions. Minerva herself underwent the transformation, expanding her consciousness to encompass the global network of reality guardians. She could feel Thaddeus's presence in the quantum foam that underlay all existence, his will maintaining the stability of local space-time. He wasn't alone, she discovered. Hundreds of other guardians existed in similar states, each one holding their assigned section of reality together through conscious choice. Sometimes late at night in the reconstructed observation dome, she could hear their voices in the static of radio equipment. They spoke of the loneliness of their vigil, the terrible responsibility of maintaining existence for beings who would never know how close they came to non-existence. But they also spoke of the beauty they could perceive from their expanded state of consciousness, the intricate dance of matter and energy that created everything from stars to flowers to human thoughts. The network grew stronger with each passing year. New guardians joined the ranks as old ones transcended to even higher states of existence. They developed better techniques for training candidates, more effective protocols for containing void incursions, and deeper understanding of the relationship between consciousness and reality. But they also discovered that the void was learning, evolving, becoming more sophisticated in its attempts to breach the barriers they had erected. It began targeting individuals with specific psychological profiles, those whose grief or despair made them vulnerable to its influence. It learned to mimic human emotions and motivations, making its offers of oblivion seem like genuine solutions to life's problems. The war between existence and nothingness was far from over. If anything, it was intensifying as human consciousness evolved and expanded its reach into previously unexplored regions of reality. Each new scientific discovery, each deeper probe into the fundamental nature of the universe, created new opportunities for the void to establish connections with the physical world. But the Guardians were ready. They had learned from Thaddeus's sacrifice and the sacrifice of countless others before him. They understood now that consciousness wasn't just a byproduct of complex matter, but the force that allowed matter to exist in the first place. Every thought, every emotion, every moment of awareness was a vote for the continued existence of the universe. Years passed and Minerva aged, but her expanded consciousness remained sharp and focused. She published papers on consciousness cosmology under carefully chosen pseudonyms, seeding the scientific community with ideas that would prepare future generations for the truth about reality's fragility. She couldn't reveal the full extent of what she knew without risking panic or disbelief, but she could plant seeds that would grow into understanding when the time was right. The general public remained blissfully unaware of how close they had come to non-existence. They went about their daily lives, falling in love, raising children, creating art, and pursuing dreams, never knowing that their ability to do so depended on the vigilance of guardians who had given up their physical existence to maintain the cosmic status quo. But in certain circles, among scientists and philosophers who had demonstrated both brilliance and wisdom, the truth was slowly spreading. Universities established secret departments dedicated to consciousness research. Government agencies created classified programs to monitor unusual phenomena that might indicate void incursions. Religious leaders began incorporating new understandings of the relationship between faith and physical reality into their teachings. The world was changing, becoming more aware of its own fragility and the role of consciousness in maintaining existence. It was a dangerous transition because knowledge of the void's existence made it easier for the void to establish connections with susceptible individuals. But it was also necessary because humanity was approaching a level of technological and consciousness development that would soon make such knowledge inevitable. 10 years after the incident at the Arctic station, Minerva stood in the same observation dome where Thaddeus had made his sacrifice. The equipment was more advanced now, capable of detecting void incursions with unprecedented precision. The aurora borealis danced overhead, its light stable and eternal, held in place by forces both seen and unseen. She could feel Thaddeus's presence in the quantum field that permeated the dome, his consciousness intertwined with the fundamental structure of local space-time. He had become something beyond human, yet still recognizably himself. His love for his sister, his dedication to understanding the universe, his willingness to sacrifice himself for the greater good. All of these human qualities had been preserved and amplified in his new state of existence. "Are you at peace?" she asked the empty air, knowing he would hear her. The response came not as words but as a feeling, a sense of profound contentment mixed with eternal vigilance. He was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. The grief that had driven him to this point had been transformed into something beautiful and necessary, a love so vast it encompassed the entire universe. Minerva smiled, tears freezing on her cheeks in the Arctic cold. She understood now why Thaddeus had been the perfect choice for this role. His experience with loss had prepared him for the ultimate sacrifice, but more importantly, his capacity for love had given him the strength to maintain his humanity even in an expanded state of consciousness. The story of how atoms formed from nothing had been answered in the most profound way possible. They were held in existence by will, by the conscious choice of beings throughout the cosmos who understood that something was infinitely precious compared to nothing, and as long as there were those willing to stand guard at the boundary between existence and void, the universe would continue to remember how to be. In research facilities around the world, new candidates underwent training to join the ranks of the observers. They learned to expand their consciousness while maintaining their connection to humanity. They studied the delicate balance between curiosity and caution that allowed scientific progress without risking catastrophic void incursions. Most importantly, they learned that knowledge without wisdom was the greatest threat to existence itself. The universe continued its ancient dance of matter and energy, stars being born and dying, galaxies spinning through the cosmic dark, life evolving on countless worlds. But underneath it all, in the quantum foam that underlay reality itself, the Guardians maintained their eternal vigil. They were the unsung heroes of existence, the consciousness that held the cosmos together through sheer force of will. Their sacrifice had made possible every sunrise, every laugh, every moment of love and discovery that sentient beings would ever experience. They had chosen something over nothing, and in doing so, they had ensured that choice would remain available for all conscious beings who came after them. And in the Arctic wind that howled across the tundra, where Dr. Thaddeus Grimm had first discovered the void, if you listened carefully on the clearest nights, you could sometimes hear the whisper of those who had given everything to ensure that something, anything, would continue to exist in the face of infinite nothing. The aurora borealis still danced overhead, its lights now stable and eternal. A testament to the power of consciousness to maintain existence against all odds. And somewhere in the space between existence and nothingness, the Guardians continued their watch, ensuring that the universe would never forget how to hold itself together. The story had no ending, because the story was reality itself, an ongoing choice between something and nothing that would continue as long as consciousness existed to make that choice. And thanks to the sacrifice of those who had gone before, that choice would remain available for generations yet to come, in worlds yet to be born, under stars that had not yet learned how to shine.